So, hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at. We still have folks coming in from the waiting room, so we'll wait just a minute while we get everybody in for the meeting here. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started here. I know we have some others who will be joining us. Um, I'm Dave Carter with Flowery Hill Institute, along with Chris Roper, my fellow regional director. And we're really pleased today to have two gentlemen that have brought really clear crystal balls with them. They promised me that because we're talking about something that I think is very important to everyone out there, whether you're operating a processing plant already or developing one, and that's navigating the economic turbulence that we have. So we're really pleased to have with us Dr. Marty Matlock out of the University of Arkansas and Dr. Darrell Pill out of the Oklahoma State University, both who have done a lot of work in this area. Before we get started, let me just cover a few groundkeeping or housekeeping rules here. Number one, this is being recorded. So if you know of somebody that wasn't able to tune in this afternoon, they can certainly download it and watch it. We may also have an FAQ document that we'll put together to accompany it moving forward. Also, after the roundtable here, you'll be receiving a two-question survey. First of all, what did you think of today's roundtable? And number two, what are some ideas that you have for future discussions? We're always looking for new ideas to have for Chris and I to kick around. So with that, I'm going to ask our two guests to do a brief self-introduction. So Marty, I'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Dave and Chris and Flower Hill folks for inviting us for this important conversation. I'm Marty Matlock. I'm a professor of biosystems or biological and ag engineering at the University of Arkansas. For full disclosure, I have my PhD in biosystems engineering from Oklahoma State University, a master's degree in botany, plant physiology from Oklahoma State University, and a bachelor's degree from agronomy, soil chemistry from Oklahoma State University. And I was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, about 30 miles from where Darrell is sitting now. So we have some pretty deep connections here. I've been at the University of Arkansas. I did a 5-year stint at Texas A&M before moving back north to God's country. I've been at University of Arkansas for 25 years, and about 4 years ago, I was asked by then Secretary Vilsack to come to DC to serve as a senior advisor as we were dealing with food system supply chain disruptions from COVID as a senior advisor. So I spent about 18 months working with Secretary Vilsack to try to get the American Recovery Program implemented at USDA for especially meat and poultry, fruits and vegetables, other supply chain initiatives out the door to fund and get the system stood back up and to try to help make it more resilient to other disruptions so that we wouldn't turn around and be back in the same place in 6 months or 6 years. So it's been quite a journey. Right now, I'm a professor, a 9-month tenured professor at Land Grant University, the best job in the universe. Tell your kids if they really want to have a cool career, this is the one to get, and I can help them along the way. You've got my email.
Great, thank you, Marty. Yeah, Dr. Pill. Yeah.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks again for the invitation and the opportunity to be a part of this discussion this afternoon. I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. I've been here since 1989 and had the same working title that entire time as the Extension Livestock Marketing Specialist. I was raised in Montana. I have bachelor's and master's degrees in Ag Econ from Montana State University. And then my PhD is from the University of Illinois in agricultural economics. And again, I've been here for a little over 35 years, going on 36 years now in this same position. So, most of my work relates to the big picture market situation, working with everybody in the industry, from producers all the way through consumer issues and beef demand. We'll talk about a lot of these things, I think, today.
Right. Well, thank you. You know, Marty, you mentioned your previous stint, and I was thinking this morning, you know, a lot of the work that we're doing now came out of another time of some economic uncertainty, namely the COVID pandemic. And I know the work that was done to try and support smaller meat and poultry processors was intended to create a more resilient system. And give us just a little bit of the background on that, and you know what your thoughts were in trying to put that together.
Sure. For the participants, Nicole just posted the link to USDA's meat and poultry supply chain website. It's easy to find. It's usda.gov/meat, and that will link you to the site. And that really encapsulates the body of work we implemented. Many of the participants, I'm sure, are aware of this. What we were struggling with as we were dealing with food supply chain disruptions where the producers couldn't get their animals processed because processing facilities were disrupted by COVID and disrupted by post-harvesting or post-processing supply chains. They couldn't, so we had this bottleneck at the processor in gate, and that means that we were having to euthanize animals at some level, and it was for the producers. It was catastrophic, and it's also those of us who work in animal agriculture respect the value of the animal's life, and we saw that as an unimaginable waste to lose that animal at the point of processing. So one of the challenges we dealt with is the efficiency-driven consolidation of meat processing, and the fact that we had 86% of beef, as an example, processed by 4 companies. And we recognized that we were missing the whole middle of mid-scale processing. Now we worked with the chief economist at USDA and with Jason Lusk, who's now a dean at Oklahoma State University, and other economists to understand what was going on. Seth Meyers, not the guy from television, but the chief economist at USDA, helped us understand the problem. And the big challenges were the economies of scale that you all as processors deal with. You can't compete with the big efficient and big scale processors who often set markets for the raw material, the animals coming in, and also influence markets for the products going out on an even basis, because you just can't be that efficient at the scale you operate. Maybe you can be that efficient, but barriers to entry into the market are huge. We had cold chain disruptions. So even if you could get the animals and get them processed, you couldn't get them to market, you couldn't hold them. So the whole system was really stacked against small and mid-scale processors. And so we worked very hard to try to understand how the federal government, as this big, clunky system, could impose solutions. Impose is too strong a word, offer solutions. And when we took in over 800 comments from the processors, and we analyzed those comments, and we came up with some basic strategies. You needed grants and loans for upscaling processing capacity. Grants because some of this equipment is just too expensive, and you can't. So we provided a series of grants and guaranteed loans, because finance for meat processors is very difficult, if not impossible, to get in any conventional way. You can get financing to build a housing development that will go bankrupt, but you can't process a meat plant, or you can't finance a meat processing plant. So that was one of the challenges. Workforce development, major issue. Having employees who had the skills to do the work. And then the procurement issues with the federal government. We understood that in order for mid-scale meat poultry processors to be successful, there needed to be a competitive advantage for being mid-scale, small scale. And so we worked with the federal government on procurement to provide incentives for institutional markets to buy small and mid-scale from small and mid-scale processors. But we also learned very clearly that the real opportunity for resiliency in economics in these systems is post-processing value adding, whether that's packaging with breading, whether that's packaging with other seasoning, some other than just quarter carcass distribution as wholesale. That sort of either whether direct to consumers or direct to institutions with some value added was absolutely key to the survival of the sector. And I know one of the things that Daryl and I have talked about numerous times, a couple of times here, is also the fact that mid-scale processors are challenged with the secondary products of animal harvesting, especially beef and pork, hides and offal, and trying to develop strategies for implementing value added rather than cost effective, or rather than cost added solutions to that side. If you go to the website I indicated, some of those programs are still functional. I'm no longer in the government. I'm back at the university, and and all the people I worked with are gone. So I don't know what's going on. You know better what's going on now than I do with the federal support system that we stood up. I hope some of it's still in place for you and still functioning because it's not partisan. It is absolutely key to the security and resiliency of our food system from the processors and producers and consumers' perspective.
Thank you, Marty. Yeah, and that's why we're glad to still be here and working with the folks. Chris and I, we've had more than 1,500 requests for technical assistance since we began the program. So it's been great. Dr. Peel, you've worked with across the scale with the largest processors down to the smallest, and you have taken a look at a lot of economic situations that have affected our sector. What are some of the economic challenges that you see right now, particularly impacting these mid-scale, smaller processors?
Yeah, we're in a completely unique environment, particularly, and most of my work is really on the cattle side. So I'm going to talk mostly about cattle. Some of this applies as well to the other meats, other livestock species as well. But the cattle industry in the U.S. right now is in a very unique, unprecedented situation. Just from the overall picture. And I want to make a few comments about the big picture market setup, and then we can get back to, what does that mean for the small to mid-sized processors and some of the specific challenges for them. But, across the whole industry, the situation right now is that we find ourselves with multi-decade lows. Coming into 2025, the U.S. beef cow herd was the smallest since 1961. And so, and in fact, the total cattle inventory in the country was the smallest since 1951. And so numbers have been getting tighter. The beef industry historically has been cyclical. It's been cyclical for 150 years. And it has these tendencies. But what we've seen in the last two cycles, the last two lows, is that we've had exaggeration of those normal seasonal tendencies because of drought issues in the beef industry. And so we find ourselves today with these very low numbers. The last low we had was about a decade ago in 2014, and we're actually 1.1 million head of beef cows smaller even than we were then. All of that to say that because of the overall tightness of numbers, if you're following it at all, that we've got record high cattle prices across the board for all kinds of cattle. We've got record high beef prices at the wholesale and retail levels. And so there's lots of supply driven fundamentals here that are really driving the market. We've had incredible beef demand to match that, which is why we can maintain these record high prices at the consumer level. But there's also lots of challenges along the way. One of the things that happened, without going into all of the minutia of the supply, the beef industry is extremely complex with all of the different sectors and dynamics and the geographic dispersion and everything else in it. But the bottom line is that when prices go up like they have now, prices they go up farther and faster for the smaller animals closest to primary production. So at the cow-calf level, we've got record high prices. The market is, in fact, trying to incentivize rebuilding the herd. We're smaller than we really need to be. And then at every level above that. So if you think about the feedlot level, they buy feeder cattle, they sell fed cattle. The buy-sell margin for all of those margin operations above the cow-calf level are generally under stress in this kind of a market environment. And the most stress we've seen for the last 2 years up to this point has been at the processor level. And this is everybody. Large packers, small packers, everybody is really caught in this challenging, sort of adverse buy-sell margin because of the supply-driven price increases from the bottom up in terms of animal production. And so that's the environment that everybody's in right now. And again, without getting into too much of the detail, the bottom line is it's going to be a while before this is not going to be a fast process. The last cattle cycle we had was actually a very rapid expansion and a fairly quick burst of the bubble, if you will, of the high prices and back down to lower prices. That's not going to be the case this time. It's been slower to build up, and we haven't even really started the process of rebuilding the herd. And so we've got tighter supplies yet ahead of us. We've got declining beef production nationally ahead of us, and we've got even higher prices ahead of us as we go forward. We're going to be in this environment, I think, for much of the rest of the decade, broadly speaking. Somewhere in there, we'll probably actually have a peak, but I think, broadly speaking, we're going to have an elevated price plateau, if you will, for several more years as we go forward. So that's kind of the broad environment. Now, again, depending on if you're a smaller or mid-size or specialty market, whatever level you might be working at, your situation may or may not be directly tied or as closely tied to those broad market fundamentals. Maybe you don't have as much of the supply challenge at some level if you've got arrangements or partnerships arranged for supply of cattle and so on. But the overall values are driven by the broader market, and those are going to continue to be a challenge.
I think, yeah, that issue of having a relationship with your suppliers is critical in these kind of times. I forgot to mention at the outset for folks, if you want to post some questions, please type those into the Q&A, and Chris and I'll pass those along. And Chris, before we move on, you might, how some of these issues, how is that affecting the folks that we're dealing with, that we're working with right now?
Well, and I want to add too for our panelists, just some of our viewers that are tuned in right now. You should know that we have viewers and folks from Maine, New York. I see folks from South Dakota, Washington State, Colorado. So, our viewers and our technical assistance applicants that we work with are all over the United States. So, the markets that they deal in, some are very remote markets. Some are more populated. And as we mentioned, during our call the other day, some of our processors are strictly fee for service, and they're relying on these farmer feeders to bring in their animals. And a lot of these farmers are, opting to sell those animals at market because of the high prices. Where I know some of our other processors that are dealing with more branded meat programs, they're obviously taking advantage of those higher prices as well and getting more product on the shelf to sell. So there's different challenges, as you mentioned. And if you folks have questions that are on, please make sure and put them in the chat, and we'll try to field those. But so we know we have some variations with some of the processors we work with. Some are being impacted by some of our farmers and some of our our customers not bringing in as many beef, whereas on the flip side, some are continuing to fuel that high market of beef prices and getting more product out the door. So, we want to talk about diversity for sure today, and make sure that you've got a diverse operation, and please bring your questions on that too. But, I think that's something we'll hit on here coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, bringing up the diversification, that was something we did mention the other day that, Dr. Sarah Lowe wrote a paper a couple years ago out of the University of Illinois that talked about um, diversification is critical to be a smaller processor. You're not going to win the battle of producing a 1 pound brick of generic ground beef to go into Kroger. So, it's that. And Dr. Bill, yeah, talk a little bit about, what some of the work that you've done through extension and what some processors are doing with diversification.
Yeah, Dr. Matlock mentioned a little bit earlier that we've got challenges with being efficient, and it's the the overall cost efficiency that has driven the structure of our industry as it's evolved over the last 30, 40 years in this industry. And clearly there are efficiencies of scale for those larger operations and so on that a smaller processor has to overcome. And so, there's lots of challenges when you scale that thing down. And again, thinking specifically about beef, but it applies to a lesser degree for pork or even poultry. The thing about meat processing is that it's a disassembly process. So as an economist, we talk about, we normally think about taking inputs and producing one output. In this case, we're raising one animal as a single input, and we're turning that into several to hundreds to thousands of different products when you disassemble that animal. And so the marketing challenges and all of the logistics that go with managing those markets is incredibly difficult. And when you scale it down, you still got an animal. You're still starting with the same kind of animal. So, you can't just scale down and say, I only want to work with this part of the animal. You've got the whole animal. You're going to get that whole set of products every time. And so, and that's always one of the challenges, is that a lot of times we can identify whether it's local or regional, whatever level and whatever kind of maybe specialized or sort of niche markets that we can identify that have particular demands that we can meet. But it rarely utilizes the whole set of products that come out of these animals. And so you've got challenges of trying to, one of the diversifications is just to develop markets to utilize all of those different products. You may be able to sell a handful of the high-end products for a premium, but in the case of beef cattle, you can't afford to grind the rest of the product, the rest of the carcass all the time. Maybe ground beef is a big part of your market. But the point is, you've got to utilize all those products and find markets for those. And then Marty also mentioned earlier the challenges of the associated things that come with this disassembly process. Again, we're not bolting stuff together and selling one unit. We're taking it apart. We've got markets for meat products and so on, but we're going to generate some byproducts, either edible offals or lots of other inedible products, hides, and so on. And those can potentially be a source of revenue, but if they're not a source of revenue, then they're a source of cost. There's no in between. And so it's one or the other, depending on where you are and what your situation is. You're either going to be able to find a way to market those products, or you're going to have to pay somebody to take them away and dispose of them for you, or do something else with them. So there's just a lot of challenges in that regard in developing a robust set of markets. And then, when you think about the seasonality of producing animals, most of the time, animals by their nature and the forage base that we raise cattle on, for example, driven by an annual, green grass season and so on, means that it's pretty hard to have a consistent, reliable flow of fresh product on a year-round basis. And so, you go develop a market, restaurant, or a restaurant or some other outlet that is willing to utilize your products, but then they're going to expect you to be able to provide the same product every week of the year. And so right away, what's small scale then becomes a bigger scale challenge of being able to meet that need. And so there's just a ton of problems that you have to, or issues that you have to deal with to make it work. And it requires a lot of work and a lot of innovation sometimes to be able to put together all the pieces that can make that really a feasible process.
Marilyn, I see you nodding your head with some of that. Yeah, you want to add some comments?
Now, generally, I think that our participants probably have deep experience with and frustrations with these disjointed supply chains. The whole point of having mid-scale processing capacity is to decentralize processing, to move it out of 5 or 6 major regions in the nation so that we have shorter haul times for the animals. That's healthier for the animals, less shipping illnesses. less cost for for both the producer and the processor to get the animals to a processor. But what that means is we have distributed networks rather than centralized facilities. There is no easy solution to a distributed networks supply chain other than distributed supply chains, which means lots of smaller trucks on, I'll use the term milk run because that's effectively what it is, going around to pick up the offal, going around to pick up the hides in order to create a market. That's the only way to do this. Otherwise, you're putting them in a dumpster and hauling them to landfill, and that's costing you tipping fees. The problem with that is processors are meat processors. They're not typically institutional or business organizers and collaborative organizers. And so there's an opportunity, but also a need for that. And this is where Flower Hill has been so important, is to try to help create that missing middle. We used to have all of this in our supply chain. This never really was a problem 150 years ago. This is a product of consolidation and efficiency, which reduces costs to the consumer. It doesn't increase value to the producer or the processor. It reduces risk, but it doesn't increase value. It reduces, in fact, value to the animal producer, and it creates competitive pressure on the processor. So we are working against market forces here. What mid-scale and small-scale producers are doing is working against them. Now, I teach risk assessment and resiliency. That's one of the reasons Secretary Vilsack wanted me in the room to help solve some of these problems. Because here's the thing. What makes a system resilient is exactly the opposite of what makes it efficient. What makes a system resilient is that you have redundancy. That if one part breaks, there are other parts to take over. You have 50 instead of one, or at least you have 5 instead of 1. So if one goes down, you got 4 more or 49 more to take up the slack. When you only have 4 meat processors for beef in the United States, 4 companies, and one of them loses 25% of capacity because 2 facilities go down, guess what happens? Beef cattle stack up. Delivery dates are pushed. And then costs go up throughout the supply chain. So what we're trying to do is nothing short, and this is something we had to explain with thank goodness we had competent economists to help us with this. We had to explain to all the Ivy League trained lawyers who are running the show in DC, and I don't care what party you're from, that's who runs the show, who don't know anything about agriculture, how this system works and why you need that sort of government intervention in order to create non-market based resiliency, because the market doesn't pay for resiliency. The market pays for efficiency.
Great. And that kind of ties in, Catherine, and I hope I'm getting this right, Catherine. Catherine, a friend from Maine, says, do higher prices impact plus or minus on both capacity of operation and markets, consumers? How do they impact the capacity, and how do they impact the markets? Yeah.
Well, I think in general, when we're talking about the high prices that run throughout the system right now, again, the reason we have that fundamentally is just because we don't have enough animals. The numbers are down, so everybody is challenged. We do have higher prices, and to the extent that you sell more, sell those animals at higher prices, yes, that's revenue. But once you get, again, in the broad system, and once you get to the feedlot level and the packing level, it's really a volume-based business. And so your cost efficiencies come from being able to operate at efficient levels. And so in a market like this, actually those large firms may actually face more challenges compared to a small or mid-sized processor, because they've got even more supply details to meet in order to operate efficiently. So that's one of the things I think a small, mid-sized processor, again, you may have your own supply concerns or challenges at your level, but they're probably more solvable in a quicker way than compared to a large processor that's processing thousands of head of animals a day across their firms in multiple plants. And so that's an advantage for the consumers. Up to this point, we haven't actually seen beef production fall that much. It's come down some. We had peak beef production in the US in 2022, and it dropped a little bit in 2023. Didn't drop at all in 2024, but that was kind of a short run thing. But I do expect over the next at least 2 years, we will see decreasing beef production totally in the US. Now, again, at a local or a smaller level, may or may not see any changes there, but we are going to see in total less beef production in the country. That means that there will be rationing of a smaller supply. Consumers are going to make some changes in purchasing behavior, and we're probably going to see even higher prices. That's how you ration a tighter supply in a market-based system. So we're going to continue to see these both supply, the quantity side, as well as the price side issues affecting the market broadly. And again, I think the challenge for an individual at a local or smaller level is to figure out whether if you can in fact sort of insulate yourself from some of that a little bit and be able to get through this in a little better shape in terms of maintaining your supply chains, maintaining your markets, and taking care of your consumers and providing that value for them.
I got to tell you, the last year's average cost per hundredweight on the hoof of beef, 175 a hundredweight. We're at 240, 235 now for steers.
Yep.
And heifers, 200 little less. So you see, this is what what every processor is dealing with. And Daryl's exactly right. It's a mass flow problem. I'm an engineer, so it's how many cattle head you're processing per day, and how many head you've got to have lined up in shipment to your facility to move them through. This is where the mid-scale processor has more agility to be more nimble, has a better relationship with the local producers, so you can nudge your schedules around a little bit more. So this is absolutely a key advantage that mid-scale and small-scale processors have over the large-scale processors, who are really struggling, and they're going to struggle over the next 5-6 months with $2,000 to $2,200 a head live weight animal.
Alicia's saying, so what are the factors that are contributing to the tight cattle production?
Well, we got here again largely because of drought. So the industry is naturally cyclical. We last had a cyclical peak in inventory in 2019, and so the underlying cyclical tendencies in the market would have had us pull back a little bit. But we really got into drought. It really started in 2020, but really 2021, 22, 23, 24, we've had drought issues ever since then in some part of the country. Generally kind of moving around. Almost everybody's had a turn in the barrel as far as producer areas, at least in the middle part of the country where the bulk of the beef cattle are. And so, again, we liquidated not because we wanted to, but simply because we did not have any choice. And so we find ourselves smaller. And the thing about the beef industry that's really unique, and this is unique even compared to say the pork industry, is it's a one-for-one thing. Cattle biology is, first of all, it's a slow biological process. Cattle gestation times and production times are slower, but more importantly, they have one animal at a time. And if that one animal happens to be a heifer, you can either route her through the feeding side to become part of the meat supply, or you can use her for breeding, but you can't do both. You get to make one choice with that heifer. So now that we find ourselves with limited numbers and tight supplies and high prices, the only way we're going to fix that is to make it even tighter by not feeding as many heifers as we have been, saving them for breeding. And so we're going to squeeze these cattle supplies even farther over the next 2 years at least. I think we're probably starting that process now, although I don't have any data to really confirm that. But it appears to me that it's happening. But it's going to be a slow process. And in the meantime, we are going to squeeze supplies even tighter and push prices even higher.
Great. We're starting to get some great questions coming in here. And before we turn to those, I do want to touch on one other topic here, because we've had so much conversation over the last few months about tariffs and the impact that they're having on processors. And I know when Chris and I visit with folks, the first thing is, well, equipment prices or construction, those type of things. But we talked the other day that there's some broader impacts that they'll have on that. Talk to us a little bit about that, Dr. Peel.
Yeah, it's a really complicated thing for a lot of reasons. Honestly, the tariffs in this case are so broad based; they're affecting virtually every sector of the economy, and so every market. And again, the nature of the beef industry, because of its complexity, most people recognize that we both import and export beef. And that's one of the most common questions I've gotten for many, many years. Why do we do that? Well, again, it highlights the fact that beef is not one thing. Beef is thousands of different products that this industry produces. And when we trade, it's no different than any other market in that markets are trying to sort out which products have the most value in different destinations. And so we export things that have more value in some other country. We import some things to supplement supplies where we don't produce as much. And it really comes out of this package of stuff you get when you disassemble that animal into its component parts. And so we've got both imports and exports going on. We are starting to see some of the trade impacts in terms of data. We just got trade data for April just a week or so ago, and it's only the very beginnings of some of those impacts. There are going to be a lot more going forward, and it's going to be tricky to sort of net out all of those impacts because we've got multiple things going on, not only directly with the meat products, but also affecting live animal trade, but then all the input markets that's already been mentioned, whether it's equipment or just other markets. And then finally, from my standpoint, the key to the markets we've enjoyed up to this point has been the strong consumer demand and just the broad-based volatility and shocks to the economy of, from a macroeconomic sense of everything that's going on right now. It really has the potential, or at least there's some threat there, that we could in fact impact consumers, generally speaking, enough so that we impact that overall consumer demand. Consumers buy beef because they like it, because they have the willingness and the preference for it, and also the ability to purchase it. And if we get into enough of an economic shock, broad-based in the economy, we may lose at least the ability, if not the willingness, to some extent to purchase that product. So there's lots of things going on. It's going to be a long process, and we will continue to see impacts developing over many months through these very complex multi-sectored supply chains that we deal with in this industry.
Don in South Dakota raised a interesting question here. Marty, you were talking about the milk run. And, we talked the other day when we had our conversation that tariff, one of the places they are impacting is the offal market, because so much of the big guys export so much of that. Explain, some of the thought about having some aggregation of this and being able to do that. We've talked about that in some of our previous roundtables.
Economies of scale are really what low-cost food is based upon. That is high volume, low profit margin. High volume, low profit margin means you got to have an efficient way to get a lot of stuff to a market. And the problem we have with mid-scale processors is if you're hauling a single rendering truckload, a 1 ton to even a 2 ton rendering truckload to the renderer every 2 days, that's not efficient. If you're going 70 miles at a 140-mile round trip, and you're lucky if you've got a rendering facility for pet food or other purposes that close. And so you may be going 200 miles each way. And so that sort of cost of operation for a mid-scale producer, it's just cheaper to put it in a dumpster and dump it under the ground and bury it. And cheaper, but goodness, you're burying money. And that's, so how do you make that work? Well, you have to have effectiveness of scale. The reason milk producers don't carry their milk to the dairy in cream cans anymore on a horse cart is because it's not efficient. So that's the reason you have a 4,000 to 10,000 gallon truck coming around and collecting, sorry, turn my phone off, a 4,000, 10,000 gallon truck making the milk run, picking up the milk on a schedule every 2 days. You have cool chain capacity in the dairy for them to come along and get the milk, and off it goes to the dairy processor. That's how you create efficiency. We need similar types of efficiency in our mid-scale processors. You can't just process meat if you're a meat processor. You got to think about your entire supply chain. You got to have relationships with your producers, and you have to have relationships with the post-processing value add all the way down to the consumers. And that means you got to be a whole lot more sophisticated than your granddad. And that means that technology is going to be the key. That means coordination is going to be the key. That means you better have a good corporate lawyer on speed dial, because you're going to have contracts that you're going to have lots of flexibility on. That's the way it's going to go. And Dave, if I could jump ahead based on this to Peter's question about Prairie Farms, this is what happened to them. Pure Prairie Farms used a vertically integrated poultry processing management style, which is exactly what Tyson's and all the other big bird producers do, whether it's the Arkansas or the Delmarva Peninsula. And corn prices, feed prices got high, and they couldn't manage the cost of the feed for their flock. They went bankrupt because they couldn't buy the feed for the flock that they owned, that the producers were producing for them. They lost control of their supply chain. Now, how do you manage that? That means you don't buy corn or your feed off of a market. You have control. You have contract providers for your crops too. You have to be fully vertically integrated or fully vertically connected in your system. There is no simplicity here, and there is no compartmentalization. And that's why, to Catherine's questions, why do the big guys go? How can the big guys weather the busts as well as the booms? Because they are diversified and they are vertically integrated. That's how they can do it.
Yeah, that's, I would definitely agree. I mean, part of it is just the size of those companies. They've inherently got, they've made so much investment in this industry. It's obviously the cost of the facilities that these large companies have, multiple facilities. And so, they are unlikely to give up that market share. They are very competitive, particularly in today's market. They're extremely competitive, trying to maintain their market share. And so they will absorb losses for a longer period of time, trying to get through the storm. Now, there are limits to that, and we've seen it over time. Adjustments in the infrastructure in the beef cattle industry are not a question of 1 year or 2 years or 5 years. It's a matter of decades. Most of the major packing infrastructure in this country is 30 to 40 to 50 years old. And so, it takes a long time for that to go away, if you will. And it's not an easy process. So I've been asked many times over the last 18 months, will we lose one of the major processors, not a whole company, but one of the plants? And my answer is, and I think it's probably going to work out that way, is more than likely not, unless they become convinced that we're just never going to rebuild cattle numbers in this country. Then they're going to hang in there, because again, if one of them falls on the sword and gives up a plant, maybe it's to save themselves, but it's also going to benefit the rest of the industry, and they're not going to get that share back. And so we're not going to see that very often. It is in part due to the fact that they are a global industry. They've got so many, they have so much incentive and so much opportunity to develop markets for all of these pieces that we're talking about. And, there's a lot of byproduct things that are very small, in and of themselves don't add a lot of value, but collectively they amount to a fair amount of value. And so that's a big part of it. The other thing is that when we're talking about, trying to, at whatever scale, small or mid scale, again, you're still operating against the backdrop of that overall environment. So the hide market is a great example right now. It's affecting everybody. Hides in the US are worth about $10 a piece right now. About 6 or 7 years ago, they were worth $110 a piece. And so at this point in time, they probably are almost not worth marketing, other than the fact that it would cost more to just dispose of them than it does to go ahead and sell them at that level. And so, and that's based on a global market, basically. Hide values are driven by a global market. So these things are all part of all part of the picture that everybody faces. But again, how it affects the smaller mid-sized processor compared to the big guys is going to be a little bit different.
I know you deal mostly in cattle, Dr. Peel, but yeah, Peter's question was, how does the failure of pure prairie farms, what do you think about that? And does the politicization, I can't say that, of its failure make it harder for other grant programs in the future?
I can take that one, Peter, or Daryl, if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because we dealt with this. In fact, Peter Frum, or is that right? David Frum from the Atlantic interviewed me and asked me as we were developing this program. So the federal government's going to infuse a lot of money into the private market. That's never worked before. What do you think is going to work now? Our argument wasn't that we could solve a problem. What we could do is reduce barriers. So the federal government sets criteria for qualifications for grants and loans, but we don't micromanage companies. The federal government, I'm not a part of the federal government anymore, but this is something Secretary Vilsack was adamant about. We don't tell people how to do business. That's their business. What we do is we set up the criteria to protect the taxpayer investment in them, recognizing that the very nature of meat processing is risky. And the reason the mid-scale processors typically can't get finance from conventional sources is because the cost of finance are too high, and because the risk is perceived and probably is too high. A certain proportion of these organizations are going to fail, and they're going to fail for no reason other than drought, which causes, and that drought could be in another part of the world, which causes grain prices to go up. Things we can't control. Every farmer knows this. Every farm supply chain person knows this, that it's a global economy, and things that happen over there affect us over here. Whether we're selling there or buying from there, or they're buying from here, it all impacts us. And those are things we can't control. That's why resiliency demands also diversity in your process. So the simple solution is anyone can make hay of a single business failure and saying, well, see, the federal government failed because it invested in those. Dave, Chris, how many organizations did the federal government invest in over the last 5 years?
Very, Chris.
Well, it would be a swag at this point, but thousands. I can tell you that just the technical assistance that Dave and I work in, we've worked with over 1,500 meat and poultry processing businesses. So, you can look at it from many levels and say, does the technical assistance investment, that's one investment. Then there's a grant investment. Then there's ongoing, technical assistance where we can connect people to accountants or to meat scientists or to ag economists. So there's long-term benefits that are there that is much more than just a one-time grant. So there's a lot of things that happen here.
So companies do go bankrupt sometimes for bad management, oftentimes for market conditions that they don't have control of. You can look at this example. You can always learn from our failures. I'm an engineer. We take data on the way down. That's how we learn. And so the question of what happened here, and the CEO of the company says they just didn't control their feed prices, and it got out of hand, and they stretched them beyond their capacity. That's why they went bankrupt. Feed costs of a poultry company, not processing, not market value, feed costs. So when you consider that, that's a challenge of vertical integration. They were creating efficiency by paying for the feed for the birds to the processors, like most poultry producers do, and that created a risk for that company. How do you diversify? How do you mitigate that risk? There are a number of strategies, and I don't have a simple solution, or I would be doing something different for a living. But what I can tell you is it ain't easy. If it were easy, everybody would be doing it. And if it were easy and profitable, we wouldn't have a supply chain challenge in that mid-scale. The mid-scale is a hard place to be. It's a critical place for the security of our food supply chain in our country, but it's a hard place to be. All the federal government could do at the time was try to make it less hard. It's not going to make it easy, just to try to remove some of the major barriers. All the other barriers remained. All the other risk, all the other uncertainties, all the other difficulties remain. And that's up to the ingenuity of the companies, of the entrepreneurial spirit of Americans to resolve that. All we can do is try to level the playing field. And that leveling the playing field also meant the trying to address price fixing from the big companies, which we had several incidences of, trying to address what I would consider to be irresponsible imports from other countries, product of the USA labeling, for example, raising a calf in Brazil until it's 6 weeks from processing, moving it to feedlot and call it an American product. That sort of thing we addressed to try to reduce the unfairness of practices from that advantages the big guys. We worked very hard to try to do that. I can't address what this administration is doing because I'm not part of it. I can address what the previous one did. So,
Well,
Dave, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and let me just, because we got some other great questions here, and we're going to run short on time, but I would just say also anecdotally, it's interesting. Yeah, Pure Prairie got so much attention on the impact, but Chris and I have been dealing with a lot of communities where the big processors are shutting down a processing plant in Utah or North Carolina or Arkansas or whatever, and the impacts on those. So.
And they get federal
so
funds too. Make no bones about it. They get federal funds too.
Yep. So Chris, run us through some of these questions we're getting here.
We have a few really good ones from Allison here. How do you think the current federal impact on removal of immigrant working class individuals from the country will affect meat production in large and small scale processing facilities and cost and availability of meat to consumers? So I think this ties to overall workforce development in general, but I'll let the professional economist chime in here.
Well, yeah, I mean, labor issues has been one of the biggest challenges in the meat processing industry across the board. Again, large and small doesn't really matter. And let's face it, at the end of the day, meat processing at the fundamental level is not really a glamorous profession. It's hard work. It takes some skills, and oftentimes you're working in environments that are a little bit challenging, and so everybody has faced that. And we have relied, and honestly, the history of this country is that we've relied on immigrant labor for occupations like this almost, from the beginning. And so what we're doing now is we're gonna add some additional challenges to that. I'm not going to debate the merits of what we're trying to do. That's a different discussion. But from the standpoint of the labor issues, it's certainly going to continue those labor challenges that industries face. Those will affect pretty much everybody. I know after COVID, I was on a state level task force in Oklahoma about ways to incentivize and support development of small scale processing facilities. And there's a handful of key core issues that come up every time, and labor is always one of them in terms of the availability of workforce. And so it's certainly going to continue to add to that challenge. The large processors, they have bigger challenges. They require bigger workforces, but they've also probably been relatively successful at solving those since the issues we got into during the pandemic. Some of them are haunting them now because we've seen large changes in just the wage structure in that industry and so on, and that has long tails on it in terms of the impacts that has. So it's going to be an issue. It's probably going to continue to be an issue at all levels of the industry, and it's not even just at the processor level. Basic farm work, whether we're talking dairies or feedlots or just farm work in general, a lot of those rely on that kind of workforce as well, and so there's going to continue to be issues there.
Since the inception of this country, hard jobs, whether it's hard rock mining, whether it's building railroads, whether it's meat processing, have always been an opportunity for first generation Americans, always. And we have seen exploitation in that space, but we've also seen extreme success in multi-generational prosperity building, starting at that sweat, the integrity of sweat, the integrity of work level. The challenge is pay, compensation. When you have 80% employment on average, 80% capacity employment at the big four meat processing facilities, because they're paying on average $17 an hour, $34,000 a year, which isn't a living wage in many states. In some rural places it is, but in many places you can't raise a family on $34,000 a year. And they generally don't offer health benefits or certainly no retirement or sick days or that sort of thing. It's often hourly. When you provide that kind of work environment, you're not going to attract labor in a low unemployment environment. And that's what we have now. And that's what we've had since COVID, a low unemployment environment. So this is an advantage and an opportunity for the mid-scale and small-scale processors, because you're engaging with butchers, not stand-in-line meat choppers. And so that means you're engaging in professionals who have broader skill sets, who can earn higher wages because they generate higher value for the company. And that means they have less turnover. That means you have more attraction to the sector. This is a real competitive advantage for mid-scale and small-scale processors. The big processors where you're standing on a cutting line are just horrible places to work. Now, I've roofed houses, not a pleasant thing to do. You do what you got to do to make a living, and you do it with integrity. Nothing wrong with sweat, but we have to make sure we value those workers. And as a member of the Cherokee Nation and a descendant of European immigrants, I have to say, God bless immigrants.
I'll hit Allison's next question. I'll hit Allison's next question here real quick so we can get to our last two. We're going to run short on time, I think. Allison asked, are there any other funds, since no more federal grants, that can help small scale processors increase efficiency with better equipment to make more value-added processes? Allison, there are some grants open right now through USDA AMS. Look at the local food promotion program, the farmers market promotion program, and the regional food promotion program. Those are three that are open today. And you should also, all of the viewers today should be looking at your regional food business centers. They have business builder grants. Many of them are not open right now, but have another round of funding that should be opening soon. So look up your area for the regional food business centers, and you should see some new opportunities coming out there. And then Kim Nesvig's question, can you give any examples of cooperative business structures that have been effective in managing the supply chain for meat processors?
They're all one-offs. It's hard. They're all one-offs. Where they're successful is because they build relationships across the supply chain, and they're often local condition specific.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's very difficult to come up with examples in this particular case. The nature, the reason this is such a challenge is because we're talking about dispersed small operations that are essentially trying to build the whole system in a bit of a silo in many cases, and so it's very difficult to do that. There may be cases where there's some regions where you could potentially do some things, either cooperatively. I think Marty mentioned, just the idea of working with maybe the byproducts or that sort of thing. There might be some cases where small firms could do some sort of co-packing arrangements where maybe they have specialized equipment to make value-added products. One of them has one type of product or one type of process, another one a different one, and then they could exchange those potentially in some sort of a co-packing arrangement.
Let me just say too that we are actually doing some technical assistance. There is one project underway that they're looking at aggregating some of the offal. One of the processors is looking at developing some equipment for pet products and bringing in ingredients from fellow processors there. So as we look at those type of cooperative models, Chris, I think we'll end it with Catherine's question here. As a small scale processor, is vertically integration feasible and success dependent upon the region?
I would say you change the term from integration to cooperation. Need vertical coordination and cooperation. Integration means ownership. You can't do that. It's too expensive. As we saw from from the poultry facility in Iowa that failed. It's god awful risky, but you can't have vertical cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. And that means networks at every stage. Networks, not single, diversified networks of resources where you have flexibility. Flexibility is how you survive uncertainty.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and exactly the same thing. Vertical integration implies a lot more investment and ownership. Vertical coordination can be everything from simple networking and information sharing all the way up to contract arrangements. But those in some package of those can be very useful to you.
Great. And Nicole, if you'll go ahead and put up the slide with the contact information. Dr. Matlock, Dr. Peel, just closing thoughts. Go ahead, Marty.
Oh, just the security and stability of our supply chain depends upon the ingenuity of our producers, processors, and distributors. We have to move away from efficiency as the singular motive for success. And that means we need to have a value system that understands that food is not just valued by dollars. Food is valued by supply chain reputation and connectivity. And I think we're moving there. I think social media is helping us move there. If your mid-scale processor is not engaged in a social media campaign for the value of your products, introducing your customers to your producers, you're failing. You have to be fully engaged in full court press marketing.
Dr. Peel?
Yeah, I would echo that and say that, anybody in a small to mid-size operation, you're not going to compete, as Marty said, you're not going to compete on efficiency and raw competitiveness. You're going to compete by being specialized and differentiated in some way. So, as an economist, I would put a lot of emphasis on understanding the demand, the market, the size of that market, and the needs of that market, and work backwards from there in terms of what you can do to supply that and make sure that the value chain is there that would make it feasible for you to operate, recognizing that you're going to be in an adverse or in a challenging cost environment just because of the scale that you're operating at. So it comes from the demand side and identifying the value chain.
I appreciate it to both of you. Chris, bring us home.
Yeah, thank you all
Closing
very
thoughts.
much. We appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Matlock and Dr. Peel. Your time is valuable, and your time has been very much appreciated today. So thank you all very much.
Everybody that's on, be looking for that 2-question survey. Let us know what you'd like us to cover moving forward. So we appreciate your time. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.